Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 9 Reviewed. We have a lot of episodes to cover, so let's just get right into them. Episode 127, Fairly Odd Pet. Timmy tries to get a new pet and ends up with a magical dog named Sparky. Everyone knows that when this episode came out, it had to win fans over. Great, they're adding another new character with the new season. It's something that they tried twice before, and it really does show with this episode. A lot of this episode feels like formula establishing. We have to be introduced to the new character, and then they have to cause the conflict, and then they have to win over the main cast in the end. All that to say, with this episode they really had to try to sell the concept of Sparky to fans. And I don't think they did a good job. Right off the bat, we're shown this fairy pet store, where Sparky then says that he's had 83 previous owners. And according to the photo album we're shown, all of his previous owners had been adults, which shouldn't know fairies exist. There's a lot of little plot flubs like that in the episode that suggest there was no proofreading involved. First, there's an ET reference where Timmy leaps in front of the moon. And the episode then explains why this was a stupid joke in the very next line, because the shots before and after the scene were during the day. Just animate the rest of the scene at night if you want to make that joke. There's also a moment where Sparky digs the house underground, where Timmy then asks Cosmo and Wanda to poof it back, which they do. But then, a few scenes later, and they can't grant a wish because their wands are underground. And how they get their wands back at the end is an even weirder thing, because they kind of just appear for no reason. But even without all that, let's say they clean up the writing errors. I still think they would have done a bad job of selling us the concept of this character. Because up until Timmy watches that DVD of the things they've done together, which I'll talk more about later, yeah, up until then, the only emotion we've seen Timmy feel towards Sparky is annoyance. The only emotion I have felt is annoyance up to this point. And so when Timmy watches that DVD, which by the way, should only contain moments from the episode because he's only had Sparky for a day and we've seen pretty much everything that's happened. When Timmy watches it, he does a complete 180 emotionally and is not believable at all. If it wasn't already obvious, it's a bad episode. If the raw emotions played out naturally based on the events in the episode, the characters should want Sparky gone, because that's what the audience wants. But I don't think that's what they were going for, and that's a failure to write a story where the emotions make sense. Episode 128A, Dinkle Scouts. Mr. Dinkelberg becomes the scout leader for Timmy's Squirrely Scout group. When it comes to episodes teaching lessons, there's two ways they can usually fail. They can either teach a good lesson in a bad way, or they could just flat out teach a bad lesson. This episode teaches a bad lesson. The lesson that Timmy's supposed to learn in this episode is that it's okay to put irresponsible people in positions of power, effectively putting himself and everyone else in danger, just for the sake of not hurting his dad's feelings. The entire episode, we're supposed to feel sorry for Mr. Turner, but it's very unearned, especially when the episode explicitly mentions that he almost got Timmy and the other Squirrely Scouts killed. The wrong character comes out on top in this episode. In this episode, it feels good when Mr. Turner gets put in his place, and they take it all away just so they can emotionally manipulate the viewer. It's nasty, it's underhanded, and it makes this episode bad. (128B) I Dream of Cosmo. Cosmo hits his head and thinks he must be a genie that has to grant Mr. Turner's wishes. I wonder how much I can even say about this one. This episode might just be the most bare bones a Fairly Oddparents episode can be. I mean, for starters, the episode doesn't even really have a conflict until a 1 minute long span near the end of the episode, where the sun just gets closer to Earth. That same thing happened in Just Desserts, by the way. Yeah, when they finally do get around to having a conflict in this episode, it just ends up being a similar conflict to one we saw in a previous episode. There's also some dumb moments like Timmy and Wanda getting shrunk, which has definitely happened before in King Chang, and they pull out lore in this episode that definitely contradicts those previous times this happened, doing so just so they can force a problem in the plot. I warned against this in seasons 7 and 8. If they keep haphazardly adding lore, they'll just contradict themselves. They've done it here, and that's really all they do of note. You know, it's interesting how they felt they needed to add this character in, Sparky, that no one asked for. But yet the only two episodes so far outside of his debut appearance have both been about Mr. Turner, who was definitely overused in Season 7. I'm not asking for Sparky to be the protagonist of every episode, but why even add a character no one wanted if you're not going to justify his existence by using him? Well, I don't know if it specifically would have made this episode better anyway. It's
a bad episode.
With or without Sparky heavily in the plot. 129A, Turner and Pooch. Mr. Crocker detects new magic at Timmy's house and searches for its source. And guys, I was struggling to come up with a synopsis. This is the first episode where I can genuinely say nothing happens. Like, I thought Farm Pit was bad in that regard, and heck, even both episodes have the crutch of Cosmo and Wanda not having their wands, which is so overused at this point. Like, guys, you've got to come up with something else, but nope, they just decide that it's the only plot point they're gonna have in this episode. Like, Crocker's searches for Sparky is so basic and bare bones that without the necessary jokes, there's really not a story to be had. I thought last episode was bare bones, and this just takes it to another level. There were two moments where I sort of chuckled, and they were Crocker getting run over and Cosmo's spatula joke. That's it. And that first one comes with the caveat that they use that joke twice in the episode, and not in a running gag way, but more of a we forgot that we did this earlier way. Outside of that, nothing happens in this episode.
It's a bad episode.
The bads already seem to be piling up, and we're very early in this season. Just through 4 episodes, the season already has as many bad episodes as season 4. It's just, even the voice actors sound tired and not like they're giving their full effort in this one. I honestly feel bad that they got roped into doing this, just because they did an audition all the way back in 2001. And that ending is one of the weakest I've ever seen. As all Timmy has to do is throw a pair of dice and everything goes back to normal. Next episode. 129B, Dumbbell Curve. Timmy wishes for everyone to become dumber than him. I gotta say, this was a pleasant surprise. Just from what the episode was about, I was not expecting it to be very engaging, or have a plot that makes any kind of sense. But somehow, they threaded the needle and they managed to at least be pretty funny with it. There's a couple of pretty good running gags, like the hot dogs and Crocker's special effects never working, and in addition to jokes, this story was actually surprisingly good. I've seen shows try the everyone becomes stupid story before, and a lot of the time it just evolves into straight up mental retardation. If you want an example of that, just look at Salsa and Basilicus from SpongeBob. This is that episode done right, in my opinion. And why it works is, instead of making everyone completely brain dead, they're all just mild versions of Cosmo, which makes their stupidity a lot more easy to stomach. I did find myself scratching my head at them stealing the exact conflict from Pipe Down, and also, Sparky gets like 2 tiny scenes, and his sole purpose in them is to tell a joke that not only isn't funny, but also completely sucks whatever momentum they had out of the current scene. Sparky hasn't really done much since his debut episode, and the times he has been there have been shoehorned in just to justify his existence. But the character himself is just a black hole that sucks away any comedy from the scene he's in. It's a sign that they shouldn't have added him to the show. But even with those things I didn't like, there were enough things here that I did like that I can, by the slightest margins, call this episode good. 130A, The Terrible Twosome. Poof reaches a phase called the Terrible Twos, and tries to freeze Earth. This episode suffers from a lack of clarity. I mean, there's already not much going on in this episode, and I could see them trying to make the climax big and epic, but throughout you really never feel like much is happening, even when the Earth is freezing over. This lack of clarity is the worst with how Poof's terrible twos are explained. Timmy is supposed to not age in this show, and so in every episode he's 10 years old, aside from Birthday Bashed, and even in that episode, it's clear that the continuity doesn't make much sense, and doesn't tie to the rest of the show. So then why has Poof aged 2 years since his first appearance? Unless the terrible twos are just something that arbitrarily happens. Especially because an entire season goes by between the birth of Poof and Foop, and yet they're 2 years old at the exact same time. But in the episode, they also say that this phase only lasts 12 hours, and is unaffected by magic. 2 things they just added in haphazardly just because. They keep giving themselves handicaps so the plot can't quickly be resolved with Timmy wishing things away, I get that, but also, if you do that in every episode, it's very clear what you're doing. But since they don't really clearly explain the state Poof is in, it's really hard to care about what's going on in the episode. It's not necessarily bad, but it's just incomprehensible, and for that reason, it's an okay episode. All I'm asking is that you clearly define the rules for these new lore things you add to the show. When you keep adding new characters to the show and new rules for how the magic system works, episodes become fuzzy when you don't explain what happens when these things interact. Especially when you insist on adding new characters that only get a couple of lines at the beginning of the episode, and take a backseat to the two you added in the previous seasons. Just keep track of how these things interact. 130B, App Trap. Timmy wishes for a cool smartphone that eventually tries to destroy his social life. First of all, I have to say, you might be surprised, but there are some little comedic moments in this episode that I did like. Cosmo's running gag about his phone being a soup can was something I didn't expect to be done so well. It's a running gag, but they vary it up each time they use it, and so it's not like those running gags where they just say a word or phrase repeatedly throughout the episode. That was rather funny. Also, the virtual Cosmo comparing and contrasting jeans and cocktail dresses was also a chuckle-worthy moment. There are other attempts at jokes in the episode, like the ending gag, but I wasn't all that impressed with it. As far as story goes, this episode is really just a better version of Superbike. The new overpowered device wants Timmy to itself, and so it goes to great lengths to make that happen. What elevates this one over Superbike is that you don't have the forced guilt element in the story, and so the conflict is free to just be the conflict. Especially in times like this, it's nice to see them cover the topic of artificial intelligence taking over the world, even if, in certain aspects, the execution of the story wasn't that great. I mean, it's nice that Sparky's involved in the story and that he gets lines around the time of the conflict of the episode, but what's somewhat tainted by the crutch they're using a lot of the season of not having Cosmo and Wanda's magic work for some contrived reason. Honestly, if it weren't for that, I'd give them props for having a story that mimics the spirit of the early seasons, where Timmy wishes for something and that thing's unintended consequences drive the conflict. That too was also tainted by the fact that it never comes as a surprise that Chatty ends up being evil though, because it's pretty much stated in the scene where Chatty is introduced, just Timmy doesn't notice. So with all the good aspects and all the bad aspects piling up in pretty much equal numbers, this episode rounds out to an okay. Episode 131A, Force of Nature. Timmy uses animals to clean up trash. I have to say, you don't think they can keep coming up with creative ideas 9 seasons in, and while some of the episodes this season have been derivative, this one seems fresh. I like that the idea behind this episode is one that makes sense for Timmy, and one that really does keep you engaged throughout. It does have the stupid crutch of Cosmo and Wanda not having their wands again, but at this point, I think it's more notable to point out when it doesn't happen than when it does. Sparky only getting a couple of lines at the beginning is a double-edged sword, because while I don't like Sparky as a character, and I think he's very unfunny, you added this character to the show, now you barely use him because you don't even think he adds much to the show. Aside from that, as far as jokes, I think the Crocker stuff at the beginning was pretty funny. Standard Crocker is an idiot jokes, and they did make me laugh. It's weird how you think Crocker is going to have a bigger role in the story, and then he just disappears from it halfway through, though. The animals also trying to get rid of Timmy by assuming he dislikes the same things they do was also a pretty clever and funny joke. Yeah, there's quite a bit of positive aspects to this episode, and the negatives aren't really that bad, so yeah, it's a good episode. 131B, Viral Vidiots. Mr. Crocker kidnaps Mrs. Turner after believing she's a breakfast troll. I had a tough time figuring out what to rate this episode, because on one hand, it does have some pretty funny moments. Cosmo's running gag of watching paint dry and then getting hit by a wall is pretty funny, and Mr. Turner gets some good moments in here as well. Really, the main problem with the episode is that it's just kind of boring at points. The story can't really figure out what it wants to be, and as a result, I wasn't really able to stay engaged. I like the callbacks to Mrs. Turner as a bad cook. They do give some variation, so it's not completely the same as what we've seen before. But there's really not much to keep this from being an okay episode. It's not terrible, but I don't think they took the concept to its fullest potential. It's like they had some ideas but couldn't really mesh them together into one thing. I'll give them credit that they're at least trying to be funny, but there really does seem to be a hard ceiling on how good these episodes can be, since they insist on heavily utilizing cliches that are real problems. Once again, Sparky only shows up so they can say they used him and to justify his existence. Once again, there's a shoehorned-in reason that Cosmo and Wanda can't use their wands. Just a bunch of little things like that that only make episodes worse, not better. 132, Scary God Couple. Foop becomes Vicky's fairy godparent and grants Vicky's evil wishes. I don't really know what to talk about first with this one. Maybe I could talk about how stupid it is that Foop gets a fairy godchild as a child. I could talk about how it's weird that anti-fairies can even have godchildren despite no evidence that it was ever possible before. I could talk about how the title card and even the title of the episode makes it seem a lot more disturbing and fanfiction-y than what the episode actually is. I could talk about how the episode is a pretty blatant ripoff of When Losers Attack. All of those would be valid criticisms, and yet I'm still not sure you'd get the full effect. This episode strikes a hilarious combination between boring and stupid. Pretty much nothing happens for the first part of the episode, and yet there's all these little things that build into me not liking this episode. Of course it's a
Bad episode.
The only thing I really liked were the scenes where Mr. Turner is clearly having a good time but has to act like he's hating it. Obviously, a couple of good moments here and there don't save this episode, and there's even a scene where they rip off Phineas and Ferb. Like, blatantly. They just turn Candace into Vicky. If that was a slight at Phineas and Ferb, it wasn't a good one, because it wasn't really conveyed that that's what they were doing, so the whole thing looks like an oversight instead of being seen as intentional. Overall, this episode was just not good, and I struggle to understand how the storytelling blunders from Fairly OddPet made a return here. They were doing alright for a while, and with this episode, that progress was wiped away. 133A, 2.5 babies. Poof and Foop take care of an egg for a school project. You know, I think this episode might have had some things going for it in the concept stage, but really, when you boil it down, no pun intended, this episode comes off as incredibly cliched, and not well thought out. The story here is incredibly light, as it doesn't seem to have a real central conflict. Yes, they're trying to keep the egg from being destroyed, but when the egg actually does get destroyed in the episode, it's such a non-event, and I think that's because they don't really build up anything in this episode at all. I get that what they were doing was a story that's already been done quite a bit, but you still have to do something and not just use a stock storyline to its basics. A much better story would be to have Foop destroy the egg early in the episode, and the rest of the episode is about him trying to hide that fact from everyone else. With the episode we got, it just feels so unfocused, and they don't really add any funny jokes. I get that they were trying, but I feel like they thought that the jokes they used in the episode were a lot funnier than they really were. And I know they haven't forgotten about how to be funny, because they have done it in this season before.
It's a bad episode.
It's on the lighter side, but with how sloppy the story was, and how confusing the character dynamics were, it just left a lot to be desired. And also, Sparky isn't in this one, basically confirming that he could have been written out of most of his appearances so far, and not much would change. Hell, it also confirms it was a bad idea to have him in the show in the first place, but you've already heard me rant about that enough. 133B, Anchors Away. Chet You Betcha stops being a news anchor after Timmy unwishes things before he can report on them. While you think it'd be bad for an episode to be derivative, I don't really mind it in this case. This episode is like a combination of Mother Nature and Kindred Spirits. Neither of those episodes were good, but for whatever reason I find that what those episodes do actually works in this case. Because here, Timmy isn't knowingly doing anything wrong towards Chet You Betcha and actually tries to fix his problem anyway. And Mr. Turner is oblivious to all of it, so it actually ends up being pretty funny. This might even be Mr. Turner's best appearance in Season 9 so far. I really like the women's size 4 joke and just how incompetent he is at being a news anchor, and some vague observational jokes dealing with that, such as Mr. Turner being too important to know the cameraman's name. This episode is a bit slow, but honestly I'll take it when they give me nice jokes, and they explore a character that doesn't really get much time solely focused on him. It's a good episode, even though its plot was a combination of an okay and a bad episode. Sometimes they can redeem themselves, I guess. Episode 134A, Finding Emo. Timmy changes personalities multiple times to impress a girl. We already kind of had an episode like this in Emotion Commotion. That was in Season 4, a season famous for having a lot of good episodes that were really close to being okay. This, however, is a
bad episode
that's really close to being okay. I suppose we should start with Timmy in this episode. Immediately, I don't really care if he wins in this episode. Why? Because he doesn't seem to care, and he takes almost no convincing to wish himself back to normal. Now, you might ask, isn't most of the episode spent trying to get him to wish himself back? Yes, you'd be right about that, but the problem is it doesn't really matter when there isn't any kind of transitional state. He's just nihilistic for a huge part of the episode, and then he enthusiastically wishes himself back to normal in a tone of voice that indicates he's already back to normal, when nothing pivotal has actually happened to change his state of mind. Yeah, you could argue this girl did, but she's the reason he made this wish in the first place, and a lot of the episode is spent with him not even pursuing her. And this love interest has no personality herself. Maybe that's why she was so malleable to have Timmy wish himself into a few different personalities in the episode. But Timmy already had a love interest that has been mentioned by name this season. She didn't appear, but Trixie Tang was at least in the minds of the makers of this show when Season 9 was made. It's just jarring that she's not here because they absolutely could have done this episode with Trixie Tang. As the episode is, it's not terrible, and it was close to okay because there were aspects that I liked, such as a few of the scenes before Timmy turned emo, but after that point, there really isn't much in this episode that's good. Episode 134B, Dustbusters. Fairy dust contaminates everything in the Turner's house. This might just be the most nonsensical story I've seen in Season 9 so far. I mean, you have this fairy dust, which has never seemed to be an issue until 13 years into this show's run, and all of a sudden, it's this huge issue that's going to make the house explode? From the very beginning, the story is hard to stomach, and of course, it seems like it was explicitly written so Turner couldn't make any wishes, as one more wish and the house explodes. But the house explodes anyway, even after a second-order attempt by the writers to take Cosmo and Wanda's wands away, as they can't use them because of the fairy dust, but then when the situation is dire, oh well, they got sucked up by the vacuum cleaner. And even as the house explodes, Timmy just wishes up a new one, which means the entire catalyst for the conflict didn't really matter, as the one thing they said couldn't happen happened and it was no big deal. And also, let's talk about this containment device. You don't think after 9 seasons Mr. and Mrs. Turner wouldn't notice this huge metal thing in their basement after they have no idea where it came from? I know they're stupid, but even that is a bit much to be believable.
It's a bad episode.
Just nothing that happens makes sense, and they keep using that crutch of Cosmo and Wanda's wands when they have no other ideas for conflict. Episode 135A, The Board Identity. Mr. Turner's drive to take Timmy to school turns into an action-packed spy movie. You'd think after the times they've tried to do stories similar to this, it would get old, but Double O Schnozmo was boring. Odd Jobs and Action Packed were good episodes, but this episode does go in a different enough direction that I'm okay with them covering a topic they've already done a few times in the past. What sets this apart is the set pieces. The conflict is technically being resolved by Timmy going along and making his dad think that he's doing more interesting things, when he was really the one behind it all the time. It's that kind of wholesome driving to a plot that seriously has been lacking lately. While the first few minutes of this episode are as boring as Mr. Turner is made out to be at the beginning, when the episode picks up, it really picks up. We see Mr. Turner do all kinds of stunts and various things that are really cool to watch, and they didn't spare us the jokes either. Mr. Crocker getting run over, the various tools Mr. Turner uses to perform surgery, Mrs. Turner confusing her husband for potting soil, and Sparky forgetting his lines were all notable jokes in the episode. It's not the funniest episode in the world, but after listing off all the jokes, it's not lacking either. I think it's a good episode, and I'm really a sucker for any episode that explores the side of Mr. Turner that lacks self-esteem, because it gives him vulnerabilities instead of having him be one-dimensional and only in the show for jokes. Episode 135B, Country Clubbed. When Timmy's parents are invited to a country club, he tries to keep them on their best behavior. I initially didn't know how to feel about this one. It actually is sufficiently funny, with the funniest joke probably being Remy using his butler to write his essay about the Titanic, which is actually a layered joke because for one, Crocker doesn't suspect anything, and also the joke is that he was actually there. Things like Cosmo's prophecy and the quote I used for this slide were also worthy of a mention, and there's even a few other things in the episode that I at least mildly thought were funny. But aside from jokes, the episode, I'll admit, does have a really messy story. There's a scene in the middle of the episode where they go back to Timmy's room after he gets kicked out, and nothing happens in that scene, which is a bit of a problem, because there's an entire subplot that could be written out of the episode entirely. It doesn't add much to the episode, it doesn't connect to the rest of the episode, it's not funny, and it doesn't get resolved. I'm of course talking about the brain-swapping machine that opens the episode. I mean, the main story can't even get itself straight on what it wants to be about, and they decided to add a subplot that doesn't add much. Sure, that makes sense. But despite my complaints about the story, I was still conflicted on which side of the good-okay line this episode fell. In the end, I gave the episode a good, just barely, by the skin of its teeth. I think the jokes here are funnier than most of what we've seen this season, and what put it over the edge for me is the fact that we get Remy Bucks aplenty in this episode, which, considering how other secondary and tertiary characters have been treated, is something to be celebrated. Some fan-favorite characters will never be seen again, and it's just unfortunate, so you have to be glad when they actually use one as the focal point of an episode. Although, with all the rich snobby people at this country club, Doug Dimmadome couldn't even get a mention? Come on, guys. Episode 136A, Doggone. After Sparky saves Mr. Ledley's life, Mr. Ledley tries to buy him. This is just a dumb story, all the way through, and it really highlights a weakness of Sparky as a character that could have been alleviated if they just thought things through in his first appearance. Since I've watched that episode, nothing in any of his subsequent appearances has clearly defined whether he's like any other fairy, that is, allowed to be in the presence of adult humans. Maybe it's okay if they don't know he's a fairy dog, but they don't really state it, and since the idea of fairy pets was added so late into the show, and since every other rule of how this world works is so clearly defined, it was always going to look really weird when you decide to not explain one thing in a show where the rules are clearly defined. And with this episode in particular, since it deals so heavily with Sparky and Mr. Turner, it's a real problem with the episode. Mr. Turner grows attached to this dog, and it's not even clear what his understanding of this dog even is. And with how ridiculous Timmy's solution is, basically telling him to poof back even though Mr. Ledley would pretty much immediately know Sparky is gone and start torturing Mr. Turner again, we're right back at square one. And the ending is also pretty weak. Mr. Ledley just gives Sparky back to Mr. Turner because Mr. Turner was the first person to stand up to him, which just makes the whole episode feel like a waste.
It's a bad episode.
Episode 136B, Turner Back Time. Timmy wishes his ancestor was a railroad tycoon. I'm gonna spare you guys any kind of build-up. This is a
Bad episode.
Now, it's not the worst one I've talked about in this series so far, but it is the episode with the most problems of any episode I've talked about. I mean, let's start with the concept. This episode borrows heavily from quite a few episodes. There's the needing to do a history report from Twistery. There's the founding of Dimsdale from Which Witch is Which. There's the lack of understanding of the value of life from It's a Wishful Life. There's the memory erasure from Secret Origin of Denzel Crocker. And there's even the changing timeline of ancestors from Timmy Turnip. And while none of those episodes had a majority of their plot stolen by this one, they still mess around with concepts here in a way that doesn't put together a good story. Timmy still gets his fairies taken away because he doesn't need them anymore because he's rich. But then explain Remy Bucksaplenty, literally a character that appeared a couple of episodes ago. The fact that that character exists destroys any chance of this story working. Well, I'm sorry, it destroys this story's chance of working if you don't explain anything further than Timmy's rich. His parents' personalities didn't change, so they're still the same neglectful parents they were before, and so what's the workaround for that? It just doesn't work how I think they intended, and as a result, it's distracting for pretty much the entire time you're watching. And also, there's some little stupid things I didn't mention, like the fact that Dimsdale's entire power supply is dependent on one single on-off button, or the fact that Timmy goes back in time to before railroads even existed, but there's such a thing as a railroad tycoon. Yeah, couldn't even bother to do that one quick Google search. Episode 137A, Cosmonopoly. Mr. Turner gets trapped in a board game made by Cosmo. I'm not really sure how this happened. This episode is a masterpiece. A lot of the other good episodes so far have been borderline okay episodes that were saved by maybe one or two moments, but this is fun all the way through. From the very beginning, there's some really genuinely funny moments, like Mrs. Turner firing up the wood chipper exactly when Cosmo mentions that it couldn't happen, or Sparky selling Mr. Crocker's own wallet back to him. Then we get into this board game, and all the tropes that play with the idea of a board game are present and used in really creative ways. They did use the crutch of not making the wands functional, but since it's used here as a joke and not really as a plot point, it's not that bad. And as we go through this board game and you see all these creative ideas, it starts to get revealed that the board game is based on how Cosmo and Wanda met, which is a nice through line to the whole thing. This was the most enjoyable watch of Season 9 so far, and while I doubt they'd be able to top it, I sure do hope I'm proven wrong. It's obviously a good episode, and really the only one up to this point in Season 9 that I consider really good. 137B, Hero Hound. Sparky feels useless, so Timmy puts himself in danger just so Sparky can save his life. The ultimate idea of this episode is something I could definitely see working, but this episode is lacking in execution. The story kind of meanders along with each action that happens not really feeling consequential, and the jokes in between those actions aren't really good either. That results in this episode pretty much just being boring for its entirety. I get they're trying to do something with Sparky's character, but when the episode doesn't really hold my attention, you're not exactly doing that. I mean, how many times has an episode shoved Sparky on the screen for 5 seconds just so he can say 1 or 2 lines and never be in the episode after that? And when they finally give him his own episode, it's one that has a slow-moving plot that doesn't know what it wants to do. They're not exactly doing a good job of justifying this character that they insisted on adding to the show. It's an okay episode. While there's not really anything good about this one, I didn't notice any glaring problems that infuriated me. It's just kind of a dull episode. Episode 138A. A Boy and His Dog Boy. Sparky becomes a human, and so, to balance the dog-human continuum, Timmy becomes a dog. I just don't get this one. This is one of the few times where I've been left genuinely speechless. I mean, they ripped off a pretty terrible episode from Season 1 with this one, but you know, it's kind of better than that. I mean, it is pretty easy to be a better episode than Dog's Day Afternoon, but they also seem to not remember that episode. I guess it isn't surprising, though. When you really think about it, The Fairly OddParents the show has stopped caring about the way its universe has been set up a long time ago. We didn't hear about the dog-human continuum the first time Timmy turned into a dog. Now, yes, it did come with a dog equivalently swapping places with Timmy, but you can't just make these kinds of things up after you've already done a similar story. And the way they go about explaining it is so lackadaisical. The episode just says, this is a thing, and then it becomes a thing. And even though it's set up like a joke, it's used as a crucial plot point in the episode. And also, Timmy can talk as a dog in this one, but couldn't the last time he was a dog. I suppose it's not as bad of an episode, and there's nothing really frustrating, but man, it's clear that with the way the story is set up, they didn't think at all that just maybe they had already done something similar. It's an okay episode, very close to being bad, but I don't think it quite hits that mark. Episode 138B, Croc Blocked. Timmy wishes for Mr. Crocker to disappear. Wow, that title. You know, this episode shows the strengths of a character like Mr. Crocker. The best jokes you can tell with him are to show him being a pathetic loser, but also an evil one, and seeing him get tortured. That's the entire setup to this. I mean, they really do establish just how bothersome Crocker is in pursuit of Timmy's fairies, even to the point of being creepy, which just adds to his patheticness. He invades Timmy's home multiple times, including his bathroom, which they missed on a joke about calling the toilet the crock pot, but I digress. His home invasions end with him getting bludgeoned and then run over multiple times, and it ends with him being repeatedly stepped on by a football team. So we see some catharsis out of seeing this evil character have some slapstick applied to him, and slapstick is one thing, but it's slapstick done right. Crocker reacts in pain every time something happens to him, so we get the effect that he is really being hurt by all these things happening to him. I'll grant that the magic in this episode is kind of stupid. Like, even Timmy himself brings up that how the wish is granted isn't what he meant. And also, the ending gag is just not funny. It's so overdone, and it also goes a bit too far even for it to be believable with Mr. Crocker. Even with those problems aside, with how engaging the story is thanks to the slapstick, I do consider this episode to be good. Episode 139A, Weirdos on a Train. Mr. Crocker tries to get Timmy's dad to turn his son's fish over to him in exchange for Mr. Dinkelberg's elimination. This is one of those episodes where I come away from it thinking of it as pointless. I'll admit that the episode at least tries to be funny and tell a lot of jokes, but I didn't really think those jokes were that funny. And honestly, I almost think they were trying too hard to tell jokes. The missile test facility thing wasn't funny, the go where joke wasn't funny, and Mr. Turner not knowing Mr. Crocker's name was also not funny. The only sort of funny thing here was the cookbook, and that's not even mentioning the story of the episode. I can kind of see what they were trying to do here, but it all sort of loses focus near the end, and it gets to the point that I can't even really tell what's happening. I don't really know what they were going for here, but whatever it was, it didn't really work. That said, it's not necessarily bad, just confusing and boring at parts. I could tell they were trying, but I don't think this turned out the way it was supposed to. I'll give it an okay. Mr. Turner and Mr. Crocker doing favors for each other is definitely a good idea, but the way it turned out is sort of half done. I think they had so many ideas they wanted to do for this episode, like having Turner and Crocker turn on each other, but also having Crocker and Dinkelberg become friends, and they just couldn't do all of them well at once. 139B, Tons of Timmys. Timmy clones himself, and the clones enslave Cosmo and Wanda. It's funny how this is a second sequel to Add-A-Dad, and it ends up kind of retreading territory that the first one did. The second version of the episode broke from the mold and became a good episode, but when you try to redo something an episode did and you don't understand why it was bad to begin with, you're going to create something bad again. What happened at the end of Add-A-Dad? Timmy gave each of the dad clones a Timmy doll, and that was supposed to be the end of that. And if we're to believe that each of the dad clones was stupid enough to be fooled by that, then why give them these Timmy clones in the first place? And the part about fairies makes that even dumber because since each of these Timmys lives in a single-parent household, they'd be even more miserable than the actual Timmy. And the dad clones pretty much disappear halfway through the episode, as if they forgot the dad clones were the setup to the episode. I just felt like this episode wasn't put together very well, and we've kind of seen similar things done better before. And including those episodes in a single-threaded story doesn't really make sense the way they've done it, because they contradict certain ideas from them. Episode 140A, Let Sleeper Dogs Lie. Mr. Crocker uses Sparky to gain control of Cosmo and Wanda. Just when you think the storytelling in this show can't get any worse, they somehow find a way. This episode just makes you scratch your head at how they thought of it. The base idea of Sparky being Mr. Crocker's dog as a kid was so thoughtless on so many levels. First of all, we got a glimpse of Cosmo and Wanda with Mr. Crocker back in Season 3, and that episode's existence seems like a pretty open and shut case that this episode can't happen. Like, they closed the plot thread. You can't go back and say, actually, there was this other character we created. And even with episodes this season, it doesn't make sense. For one, we see Cosmo and Wanda with Timmy at the fairy pet store, and they don't mention anything like, he's been our pet before, which would kind of seem important at the time. I mean, I guess it's implied that their memory was wiped, maybe. I don't know. The way this episode relates to any other is just sloppy. And we've seen Crocker's origins before. This is just bringing back new plot points from a story that was already a closed system. You can't go, oh, actually, to something that happened a decade ago. Of course it's a
Bad episode.
Episode 140B, Cat-tastrophe. Catman thinks Sparky is his arch-nemesis. And here we have another stupid one. Seriously, the story problems keep piling up in every episode, it seems. I mean, first things first, if you're not going to be able to afford a character's voice actor, just don't use him, maybe? Yeah, Adam West wasn't able to come back for this, just like they couldn't be bothered to bring back Gilbert Gottfried to voice Dr. Bender in his last appearance. The voice is distracting, and it was distracting for the whole episode. This isn't helped by the two main plot points that are the backbone of this episode. The fact that Catman doesn't know Sparky isn't Dogman, even after repeatedly being told, isn't really what bothers me. What bothers me is the fact that they didn't even try to make Dogman's design look a little bit like Sparky. And the other main thing that bothers me is the fact that Timmy says Dogman isn't real, only to try and find him and find that he does exist. He seemed pretty matter-of-fact the first time he said that. And Dogman says he's been looking for Catman for 50 years, and then admits he was right down the hall. That whole sequence is really sloppy because it implies that either Timmy lied for no reason, or he got some kind of info off-screen that we never saw. I mean, Timmy has to have at least thought that if he's a villain from Catman's TV show, and Catman exists, then Dogman probably exists too. But then, why didn't Dogman know Catman was around if he's just down the hall? That seems pretty pertinent information, especially if you've been looking for 50 years. And I just don't buy that Dogman is that oblivious in his old age. If it was a joke rather than a plot point, it still doesn't really work. The Cosmo and Wanda stuff wasn't really that funny either, but it wasn't terrible. The only semi-funny joke was the fact that the Cat Cave is just a jazz club, which was rather clever the way they set it up. But that isn't good enough to save this episode's status as a
bad episode.
141A, Lame Ducks. Mr. Turner tries to catch the neighborhood burglar. One thing this show tries to do from time to time is fake something to give Mr. Turner his confidence back. That's pretty much been a genre of Fairly OddParents episodes from the very beginning. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, but generally, if you just follow that through and tell some decent jokes along the way, it'll probably be pretty good. This episode did exactly that, and so it was. And they even did give us some variation by having Mr. Crocker be a part of the team, though it is short-lived. I think this episode is decently funny with a few of Cosmo's jokes and just the general way they're reacted to as the Ferrymans, as well as Mr. Crocker's comments about the donuts on parent-teacher night. But really, the best joke comes at the end of the episode, where Cosmo talks about life giving you meatloaf and making lemonade. He then drinks a glass of lemonade, his face turns green, and it's implied that he gets sick. Like, on its own, it's kind of funny, but just the mere possibility that it could be a reference to Nectar of the Odds makes it even funnier than it has any right to be. It probably isn't a reference, but it might be, and that gives it enough intrigue. Overall, I'd say this is the funniest episode of Season 9 so far, which, given the fact that it's not super hilarious, is telling. 141B, A Perfect Nightmare. Timmy wishes to have the perfect family. I know I just said it was telling that the previous episode was the funniest one of the season, because the previous episode wasn't that funny, but this one really was that funny. And with this one, you don't have to choose between quality and quantity. Probably the best joke was Timmy asking if his breakfast belonged in a hippie labor camp, which is just so absurd it's funny in timing. The power of perfection on this family is also something that ties the story and the jokes together, and really helps the cohesion of this episode. Details like the TV remote turning into homework when Timmy tries to watch TV, or Mr. Turner uncontrollably building a family room for the Dinkelbergs really make this episode feel, more so than others, like thought was put into it. There's a lot of little cool moments, and that doesn't stray too far from feeling like a Fairly Oddparents episode, because there's still the requisite dialogue structure. Mrs. Turner makes a by blank I mean blank joke, which is classic Fairly Oddparents form. Mr. Turner can't stop returning Mr. Dinkelberg's stuff back to him, which is absolutely something we'd expect from this character. They even manage to tell a fart joke that's actually clever. Mr. Turner asks Mrs. Turner about her new perfume, and she says that's how she breaks wind. Really clever material. If it wasn't obvious, this is a good episode, and it's not just good, it's really good. Episode 142A, Love at First Spark. Timmy wishes for his dad to like Mr. Dinkelberg's dog as much as Sparky does. I can't believe it. They've done it. They've somehow created a concept for an episode that was so awful, it overrides any good aspect you could find. Let me spare the suspense. This is
a bad episode.
If this show hasn't already had at least a dozen jumping the shark moments by now, this certainly has to be one. Mr. Turner falls in love with a dog. I can't believe it. I mean, at least Timmy and the other characters act as the voice of reason in this episode and are just as weirded out as the viewers are, but that seems like even more of an admission by the makers of this that they knew something was wrong and just didn't care. Or they thought it was funny, which I don't know how. It's disgusting, and even more than that, it has such an easy fix. Just turn Mr. Turner into a dog somehow, and you can explain it in-universe. Just make Mr. Turner a dog, and his behavior is at least a little more believable. And at least it gives this some kind of chance of working. Were there good jokes? Yeah, like Mr. Crocker's mom showing up and the question marks above Cosmo's head. But in no way are those good enough to change the rating of this episode. 142B, Desperate Without Housewives. All women disappear for 24 hours. I can't really fault them for trying a similar story to Love Struck because, while ripping off a good episode usually results in creating a cheap imitation and a worse product, when you rip off a bad episode, there's at least a chance that you might improve the original story that's being ripped off. But sometimes it's clear that no lesson was learned from the first time they tried something, and I believe that's the case here. This is a
bad episode.
Portraying men as people who are so helpless they can't so much as cook a meal, take care of themselves, or make the house look like other than a natural disaster is such a tired and cheap joke, and it's the foundation of this episode. I get that Mr. Crocker and Cosmo and Mr. Turner are idiots, but on some level there are things that even idiots can do. It gets to the point of questioning why Cosmo and Mr. Turner's wives put up with them. I mean, in the latter case, Mrs. Turner is also an idiot herself, but yet she's able to take care of herself and two other people. So what's Mr. Turner's excuse? If he's this bad at taking care of himself, how has the planet of the dads not devolved into anarchy? They're basically clones, right? So yeah, this episode's treatment of dynamics in that way is bad in the same way as Love Struck. The other way this episode is bad is that it's boring. At least in Love Struck we got to see the societies both sexes built and how they contrasted. Here, we don't leave the Turners' living room at all, and it's just the characters trying to stall out these aliens. And the episode just randomly decides that the 24 hours have elapsed, even though we never get to see the sky get dark. It's a complete snooze fest, and actually detracts from the Love Struck concept. I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to do this, but it seriously makes this episode even more awful. Episode 143A, Jerk of All Trades. Jorgen loses his job and gets replaced by Wondissimo. This episode, at first glance, seems a bit similar to Odd Jobs. Now, obviously it does go in a bit of a different direction, but with the story there seems to be very little in terms of focus. And that means that it becomes harder to keep my attention. It's like someone telling you about their day, and you can kind of follow along, but you just keep nodding and hope they leave you alone. Each story element feels like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, in an endless loop. Like, why did Jorgen's replacement need to be Wondissimo? Why did Timmy's nonsensical solution actually work? And why did the Fairy Council just immediately give Jorgen his job back, no questions asked? There's really no reason that can be gleaned from a lot of the plot points in this episode, and there's no jokes to bridge that gap and make me forget how nonsensical it all is. I'll give it an okay, just because there's not really anything too bad here, and the story could have admittedly been a lot worse, but it also could have been a lot better. 143B, Snack Attack. Mr. Crocker disguises himself in order to get 1,000,000 magical dog treats. I'm gonna put up an image on the screen right now. That's basically the representation of my opinion of this episode. The first half is where the story is the best, and has the best jokes of the episode, such as Crocker's photo booth and his computer finishing his sentences, which was the best moment of the episode. But it all falls apart around the halfway point, when the jokes stop landing and the story stops making sense. The first joke that really doesn't land is Cosmo using child labor to make the 1,000,000 spark tarts, which really isn't funny, and it basically boils down to Cosmo being an idiot, which we've seen thousands of different ways already. I mean, he thought they were elves. And from there's a lot of really weird and stupid plot points. Like, why is Timmy surprised at the secret ingredient when he was involved in the process of making the spark tarts? Why did they feel the need to have Mr. Turner eat the 1,000,000 spark tarts just so they'd have to make another batch? And they don't really explain whether the 1,000,000 spark tarts grant just one wish or multiple, or infinite for that matter. The episode kind of makes it seem like the answer is one, but then it also wants the answer to be multiple. Mr. Turner shouldn't still magically be floating after Timmy used his wish if the answer is one. And of course, the episode just fades away from what's supposed to be the climax, meaning we don't really get any kind of resolution. Since the first half was good and the second half was bad, this episode gets an okay. But man, these kinds of okay episodes where there's a lot of good and a lot of bad are way more frustrating than just the boring kind. 144A, Turning into Turner. Mr. Crocker uses a DNA replicator to try to become a clone of Timmy. Some of the story decisions being made in these episodes are quite baffling. I don't get how it takes Timmy as long as it does to suspect something is wrong. The Cosmos driver's license thing is just kinda dull and stupid, and Mr. Crocker himself is weirder than usual here, and his design replicated as his mother mixed with Timmy is unsettling to look at. Although maybe that's what they were going for. There were some interesting moments, like Mr. Crocker's fight with the Tooth Fairy that doesn't end up actually going anywhere and has nothing to do with anything. And the ending was kind of interesting, as it's nice to see all the little side stories collide. And while this isn't the funniest episode out there, it does have a few jokes that were pretty good, like the quote of the episode, and Wanda's disbelief at Cosmo getting a driver's license. And the good story elements and few jokes there were do bring this episode up to an okay in my opinion. It does have a lot of problems, but there were some tiny good aspects here and there that make this an average episode. 144B, The Wand That Got Away. After a trip to the 1970s, Cosmo realizes he lost his wand. I've been fatigued by a lot of the things that I see over and over again this season. Lack of good jokes, lack of interesting locations, cringy humor, boring stories, nonsensical stories, and the few times there have been good episodes that avoid those problems, man is it refreshing. This happens to be one of those episodes, and it's weird that of all the concepts for an episode that avoids those problems, it's one that leans into another problem I've seen way too much the last few seasons I reviewed, and that's Lost Wands. It's a cheap way of adding suspense, and they've done it way too much this season, and to be honest, in Season 7 as well. But because it is the central concept of the episode, and it doesn't hold up any actual story beyond that, it allows this episode to really show off. I like that this is a Scooby-Doo spoof, and it doesn't feel the need to completely rip off Scooby-Doo by the book. I mean, Sparky saying random things from Scooby-Doo and then explaining why was a really good running gag. And we get to see a lot of settings, from Chet You Betcha doing a news story to Mr. Turner stuck in traffic and Mr. Crocker chasing them all around. This episode uses up a lot of its time being at least interesting or amusing, if not outright funny. It's a good episode. While not the funniest episode, it certainly has its moments, and it actually is one of the few good stories this season, as even a lot of the good episodes have dull moments or plot holes this season. 145A, Stage Fright. Timmy tries to get Vicky an acting job so she'll leave him alone. As much as I might want to complain about lack of secondary characters and the overusage of Cosmo and Timmy's parents, the fact that it's led to less screen time for Vicky is, I think, a good thing. There's not really a lot you can do with a character whose only trait is that they're abusive, and that gets put on full display in this episode, as Timmy gets visibly injured many times in this episode in many ways, and it's just not fun to watch, when you know that's the only point to having Vicky as a character. And no, that rapid-fire sequence of Vicky getting injured at the end doesn't fix this episode. Really, the only good parts of this episode are with Timmy's parents at the pirate restaurant. And I think it's appropriate that they actually did bring back Mr. Bickles, as it has been a while since we've seen that secondary character. I'll grant that he doesn't really do much, and that the only things in this episode that were mildly amusing happened when Mr. and Mrs. Turner were on the screen. But you know what happens when most of an episode is awful to watch, and the only things that were alright were select parts of the B-plot. It's a
bad episode.
145B, Gone Flushin'. Timmy, Cosmo, Wanda, and Poof get flushed down the toilet. For whatever reason, this is the second episode of the last three that deals with the main characters trying to find a wand, or in this case, everyone's wands. That fact kind of bothers me, as just a couple of episodes ago, we had an episode that used that to make a good episode by utilizing a lot of set pieces, and giving us a lot of different locations. This episode does have a novel location, but doesn't really do much with it. And it's a gross, nasty sewer, which isn't exactly a good location. I think they thought the joke of the origin stories about how all these things and characters got in the sewers was much funnier than it actually was. And there was really only one good joke besides that. Mr. Turner telling Mr. Dinkelberg that he's dead to him, and Dinkelberg just accepting his fate was really well timed and was a clever way to wrap up the episode. But with the few jokes there were, and the shoehorning in of Catman, which usually makes an episode worse, I have to give it an okay instead of a good. I wanted to find some reasons to like this one, but it had enough small problems that it can't be considered good. Episode 146, Fairly Old Parent. Poof gets assigned to grant the wishes of Mr. Crocker's mother. For a 22-minute episode, this one is rather weird because this show has a reputation for its 22-minute episodes, good or bad, being big and epic, and this one is just kind of mundane story-wise. That doesn't mean it's boring, it just means it has a simple conflict, and that's fine as long as the episode can keep my attention throughout. And this episode did manage to do that. What it boils down to is that this episode has a decent enough story, and really not many boring parts to it. And the jokes that there are sprinkled throughout the episode. It's not jam-packed with jokes, but there are a decent amount, and they're funny. Cosmo turning into a grilled cheese sandwich is a joke you'd expect to be a throwaway gag they move on from, but that's not the case. He stays that way for basically the entire episode, and adds a little humor to the scenes that he's in. Timmy and Wanda at bingo night trying not to reveal their disguises was also really funny. Poof having a 5 o'clock shadow from being overworked is also really funny, and there's just a lot of little moments like that. I'll admit that it's sad we see him get overworked like this, but Timmy and Wanda are concerned for his well-being and try to get him out of that situation, so it works. Overall, I'd say it was a good episode. I'll admit that the opening concept of Fairy World trying to give fairies to old folks is a bit tough to buy, but since they made an interesting and good story out of it, who cares? 147, School of Croc. Mr. Crocker gets transferred to Spellementary School. One of the observations I've quietly made about this season, and really a lot of episodes in Season 7 as well, is that Mr. Crocker has morphed as a character from his original vision. He's portrayed a lot more as a pathetic loser than a true villain, and while that portrayal can be funny and has led to some good episodes, sometimes it's nice to see the side of Crocker we were more familiar with in the first place. This might be Mr. Crocker's best episode of Season 9, because they balance his villain portrayal of him stealing Poof's wand and basically everyone's magic with the goofier side of Mr. Crocker that has also led to some good jokes. Mr. Crocker's observation about unleaded fuel, or him not noticing the school had magic students until a kid tied his shoes, are things that complete his character more than any single type of joke would allow. So it's nice we see such a layered performance. Given the other episodes this season, I kinda thought it was something this show forgot how to do. But I do consider this episode to be good. Though, there were two things about this episode that bothered me, and they're both related. One is the continuity of the episode. Like, Mr. Crocker has met Foop before, but he acts like he doesn't know him here. Maybe you could say this episode takes place before that, but nope. You can't say that either, because Poof gains the ability to talk for the first time, and he doesn't in that previous episode, so the timeline doesn't make sense. And the thing is, this show likes to claim to have some kind of continuity, so mistakes like that shouldn't happen. Continuity aside, though, it didn't detract from an otherwise enjoyable watch. Episode 148, Dimsdale Tales. Timmy tells scary stories around the campfire, the laptop. Sometimes it is nice to just sit back and enjoy an episode, and this is an episode where that's very easy to do. There's not one plot line here, it's just Timmy telling scary stories around a campfire, laptop. The way I'm going to rate the episode is by averaging how I felt about each of the three stories. The first one is easily the worst of the three. It's just awful. It's Cosmo and Sparky torturing an innocent Wanda because they're idiots. If that story had its own episode, it alone would probably be one of the worst episodes of Season 9. Thankfully though, it's only part of this episode, and it's at the beginning, so you can easily forget about it and just watch the rest of the episode. And it's followed by the best story, which is not only funny, but has a really cool concept, where Mr. Turner boards a flight and everyone on it is Dinkelberg. Then it ends with Mr. Crocker boarding that same flight only to find that everyone is his mother. This is the only one of the three that truly reaches scary territory and comedy at the exact same time, which is incredibly hard to reach. And the third story lies somewhere between the two, but definitely much closer in quality to the second story. It's a bit hard to follow, but there are a few quick gags, so I don't really mind. I will say that the frame story is a nice one, and it allows the actual stories being told to flow nicely. And while they brought back Chester and AJ in this episode, and Sanjay, even though he just disappears, I've been waiting for them to bring back those characters, but they're essentially incidentals in this episode. They do basically nothing and have a few lines, and Chester's voice is also completely different, so that was kind of a bummer. But it didn't stop this episode from being a good episode, since really the only bad part was the opening third and the rest was enjoyable. Also, look at that fun fact. Mr. Turner, at some point in the episode when Timmy asks what his first name is, gives "I see your point" as a response, meaning that might actually be his first name. It would be pretty funny to see if that turned out to be the case, and it is absolutely the type of random gag that they'd bring back for an offhand mention and technically make canon. But it's probably not, and it was just begging the question as to what his first name actually is. Episode 149, The Past and the Furious. Timmy meets Cosmo and Wanda's past god kids. I loathe this episode, and it's for a very subtle reason. In this episode, Timmy is told not to mess around with the past, as it could have bad effects on the future, which is a lecture he's gotten pretty much every time there's been a time travel episode. The only problem with this is, it's something that, as a writer, you also have to do yourself. There's various errors and things that were already established with the show. For example, The Fairly Oddparents, whenever it has done time travel, has always done it using the time scooter. It implies that Cosmo and Wanda are not capable of time travel simply on their own, as if they were, then they just poof Timmy to whatever time he needed to go to. And if they were capable of doing that, they would have done it in past episodes. It's why, even when Timmy doesn't have access to time travel in Timmy Turnip, he still wishes for a Turnip time machine to make his wish turnip related. And even the time scooter itself appeared in multiple episodes. There was precedent that Cosmo and Wanda can't just do this with their ordinary magic. But even if we just want to handwave that and say, because magic, what about Ben Franklin? He's appeared multiple times in the show, and it's never been told or even foreshadowed that Ben Franklin is a former godchild of Cosmo and Wanda. I'm not asking for perfect continuity, but this episode brings back old concepts in a way that makes it seem like they don't even know what they're doing. And that's where I have a problem. I mean, the episode explicitly says that it's Cosmo and Wanda's 10,000th anniversary of being fairy godparents, but yet we see their first god kid in 50,000 BC. 52,000 years before the episode is even supposed to take place. Like, forget being consistent with past episodes, they can't even be consistent within the same episode. Megan Bacon, the villain of this episode, is also rather uninspired too, as she's just regurgitated bronze kneecap and Vicky tropes. Overall, this episode was a doozy of a
Bad episode.
How could it have been anything else? Episode 150, The Fairy Beginning. Cosmo can't remember who stole his final paper at Fairy Academy. If there's one thing in this show I wish they'd explore more in depth rather than use for cheap jokes, it's Cosmo's stupidity. It's just kind of taken for granted, and nothing is really done with the concept, usually. With this episode, though, I liked what they did for the most part. We get to see flashbacks into Cosmo's past, and him interacting with the other fairies. And they twist the ever-common trope of Cosmo always making things frustratingly worse by having him improve the lives of Wandissimo, Jorgen, and Cupid in different ways. Even if they all involve Cosmo hitting them with a frying pan. It's so refreshing to see his stupidity actually be used for jokes, but also carry the story in a way that isn't the exact wrong thing happening at the exact wrong time. I'll admit that for 22 minutes there's not a lot of scenery changes, but I do still think this is a good episode. I like the way Cosmo is portrayed here, as we see sort of a redemption for a character that's basically just devolved into a moron with nothing good to add to his scenes. So to see him actually get a backstory that works is something unexpected but welcome. Episode 151, Fairly Odd Fairy Tales. Wanda reads from a book of fairy tales. Here we have another episode that sort of takes from the formula of Dimsdale Tales, but where this one succeeds is that it doesn't have one bad story weighing down its potential, and it's important to make a note of that. All the stories in this episode are of a consistent good quality. The best one is probably the first one, as it is the funniest, but they all play with fairy tale tropes in an interesting way. Instead of having a regular ball in the first story, Cosmorella goes to a bowling ball wearing glass bowling shoes, and the casting of Wandissimo and Dr. Studwell as the stepbrothers was genius, as they're both archetypes for that character that work with the story being told. The second story is just as good as the first, with each of the three houses built by Cosmo, Wanda, and Sparky being representative of their personality in some way, while also being whimsical and setting up jokes. The third story, based on the story of Snow White, is probably the weakest, but I did laugh at some of the lines. I just think the pacing was kind of rushed at that one a bit. So with this episode, it's a 3-for-1 special of good stories, therefore it's a good episode. Episode 152, Man's Worst Friend. Foop replaces all the pets in Dimsdale with evil counterparts. This is an incomplete episode. It starts one plot thread only to mention it and then completely forget about it to solve a conflict that was pretty much otherwise solved. I've never seen an episode do that before, and it results in something that's basically just an incoherent mess. This show has had bad stories before. It's had some really bad ones. But I don't think I've ever seen anything like what I just saw with this. What happens is that Mr. Crocker is basically the hero and solves one of the conflicts by returning everyone's pets back to them. He then gets arrested for stealing pets, even though he should be thanked for doing everyone a favor, and then the episode just forgets about him. Actually, Wanda says they should do something, but all the characters get sidetracked, and so that doesn't happen. That plot thread is just left completely forgotten. I've never seen a worse plot hole in all of this show. Maybe that's a bold statement, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. And what's worse is the cheap ending that tries to be heartwarming, when we all know why Mr. and Mrs. Turner act like they love Sparky, and it's because all the money he's been helping bring them. So it just all feels fake, and like they didn't really know how to end the story. It's a
Bad episode.
not just any bad episode, but a really, really stupid one. And that was every episode of Season 9 reviewed. I'm gonna go straight into the rating for this season without even looking at the pie chart. Season 9 is okay. Surprised? I kind of was as well. Considering the even split in the pie chart and how the season started, I thought it was destined to be bad. But a lot of that last stretch of episodes were good, and that really did shift the perception of this season for me. They haven't completely lost their touch at this point, though there are signs showing that it could potentially happen if they don't get their act together. I think that overall, it is still the worst okay season, which shouldn't be surprising. The bad episodes are really bad, and the goods, for the most part this season, haven't been that great. If you're curious, here's my top and bottom 5. Thank you all for watching. Have a good one. Stay tuned for Season 10.